Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alex, and welcome to our August DALiM Tips and Tricks webinar. Today we're going to be talking about ES troubleshooting. Mike, is my monitor showing up now, or
I still don't see it.
try try one more thing here? Is that any better? Or
Still don't see it.
the plot thickens. So let's see what I can try here.
Hopefully, it's not just me. I mean, maybe I just don't see it. I don't know if others see it. They should just tell me to log out and log in. I'm not sure.
Yeah, if you can see my screen or you can't, just pop in the questions area real quick and let me know. So I don't want to start. Okay, everyone else says they can see it, so I think you're
Okay,
the. I
so
think
I figured it was me.
I think you're
Okay,
the odd
I'll
man
just
out,
I'll
Mike.
just I'll get out of your way, and you carry on.
Giving me a heart attack here. But anyway, welcome everyone to the August DALiM Tips and Tricks webinar. We'll be talking about ES troubleshooting. A few notes before we begin. As far as the go-to webinar settings, sometimes if you're on a smaller screen, it might scale my desktop. If you need to bring it back to 100%, you can do so using the icon in the upper left, the Zoom icon in the upper left of the main go-to webinar window. As far as Q&A, I see most of you found the questions area. You can type in if you have any questions, then basically put them in there. We will be doing a Q&A at the end. If there's anything particularly critical to something I'm discussing, I will pause the presentation and address it then. So today we're going to be talking about ES troubleshooting. The focus is particularly we'll be talking about some of the different issues you can run into with ES and the different logs you can use to remedy those issues or at least find more information. I know particularly for folks who are newer to ES or if you're coming from Twist where there's a little more centralized logging, it can be confusing to wrap your brain around. But the thing with ES is it's such a large system. There are different logs for different purposes. So there is a method to the madness, and that's going to be the main focus today. We'll be talking about monitoring system load and device queue activity, viewing and interpreting common system logs, troubleshooting program links, since I know that can be a sore point for a lot of folks, and mitigating any workflow errors with either own error links or branches, just to give those things a little smoother of a landing. So this is part of our monthly DALiM webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. You can view a list here at blanchardsystems.com/events. As soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the upcoming month, we tend to put up a little write-up for the webinar and a link where you can register. So, and if you can't make the webinars, we always do post a copy on YouTube afterwards. So without further ado here, as far as how this works in ES, you need to understand a little bit about the architecture before you can dig into logging. This is one example of an ES setup here. This is a more robust distributed install, but the same principle applies even if you're running a single ES server. At the core of ES, you have the application server, which is running the ES engine. That engine is sort of that's the brain of ES. That's kind of controls everything else. And that engine, one of its jobs is it's tasked with maintaining a master queue or a list of tasks that need to be taken out on the system. That includes anything as far as user submitted work. So, for example, if you upload a file that needs to be run through a workflow, that's maintained in that queue. That also maintains anything back of house. So, for example, if you have the workflow needs to send an email notification or there's a thumbnail preview that needs to be generated for a file, that's all maintained in that queue as well. On top of that, there's also what are called devices. And devices are little modules that perform specific functions within ES. So examples of devices, digital delivery for transmitting files, that's a device. Preview generation for generating those thumbnails, that's a device. Any eTwist workflows are also counted as devices. Those devices are basically just some module that performs a function. Now, how those modules are kept in line with the application server in that queue, the application server communicates tasks to those available devices based off of some system setup using a basically using JDF commands. It's basically a JDF API known as DALiM Web Services. So really the thing here is with logging, it depends what you're looking at. For more system or load-based issues, you're probably looking at logs related to the application server and that just basic queue of work. If you're dealing with, for example, you have a file that didn't process right through a workflow, then you're dealing a little more with the JDF error messages reported by those web services plugins. So to show you how this works in practice, I have a machine here. I have a folder here with a bunch of files that are going to take forever to go through ES. I'll give them some nasty vector content to chew on, so we have some time to look at these while they run through. So I think those should be uploading. Okay, we're good. So one of the first places you can look in here, if you want to get an idea, maybe if your system's acting a little sluggish, you're not quite sure what's going on in your system, then you can look in under the Administration tab, System Activity. This will show you basically just the kind of a 101 of what's running through your system at that time. So you can see, for example, you can see the customer, the project, files, workflow if associated, whatever step they're currently on. So for example, input file, preview generation. I think I might have an eTwist step in this workflow too. Actually not for Wiffle Dialog. Status is running means it's currently processing. Queued means it's in line to be processed next. There's limits on how much can be processed at once, which are defined in the device area here we'll be exploring in a few minutes. You can also see priority. You can set priority in here too using this button. 0 or 1, I think, is like the lowest priority. 100 is the highest priority. Handy if maybe you have a really hot file that needs to get depressed that came in behind a bunch of less critical work. You can use that to kind of bump it up a few notches. And to refresh over here, this doesn't always update too frequently. You can see here start time means, okay, these are all running in these different steps. Here's the time they started in that step. And lastly, it shows you what host or what DALiM Web Services instance this task is running on. I'm running on a single server, so they're all the same. If you had a distributed cluster, you might see in there, for example, some that are running on a render, some that are running on an eTwist, etc. What this is really useful for is if you have, for example, you're trying to see your system's acting sluggish, you can come in here and if you see hundreds of files, you know you've got a load on the system. So sometimes that's usually what that is you just need to clear the load. Maybe you have way more files than you're running through than your system was spec'd to handle. In some cases where this could come in is maybe you have a bad file. You have some file that has hundreds of thousands of vector lines in it that's never going to complete, like an twist trap, for example, just because there's so much complex content in there. You could run into a situation, for example, maybe that's holding up other work. One easy way to detect if that's the case, if you're seeing that heavy load, is you can look at those start times in here. And so usually they'll be like, these are just from a few minutes ago. If you see something from maybe 6-7 hours ago, and there's a whole pile of work behind it, you don't see everything else is queued, that's an indication that something else that you're running, that something you're running might be holding up a lot of other work. So you have the ability in that case, for example, to stop that process. And if that is exactly indeed a hung file, you might start to see work trickle through after you get rid of that. If not, it might just be the system still under a load and just needs to work through it. That's a trick I would use sparingly, but it is something that is in your arsenal if you're dealing with a large number of files processing at once. Now, if you want to see a little more detail about how this is working under the hood, there's this device area that shows you a little more information. So I'm only using one server, so I only really see one device in here, one web service device, which is my app server, my everything really. If you were using a distributed server, you'd see a few different devices in here for whatever servers you had in your cluster. In this window, it shows you all for this specific device, or for this specific web services instance, all the devices that I have installed on here. So you can see, for example, I have digital delivery. It sets that an infinite number of digital delivery files can process at any given time. For eTwist, some of these ES Core pre-flight sets, only 2 of those can go through at a time. For the most part, there aren't any hard and fast rules on setting these capacities in this screen. The main rule is this up here, the controller capacity, that dictates what's allowed to go through at any given time on that server. So here you can have an infinite number of digital deliveries at any time, but that can exceed, that limit's open there, but that can't exceed 4 simultaneous up here in my controller capacity. If you're in a situation where some of these you don't really care, digital delivery, it doesn't cost that much processing power, you might have other cases where, for example, in eTwist workflow, you only want 2 of those. So you have 4 slots up here for work. You don't want more than 2 of those being used at any given time because it's such an intensive draw on CPU or RAM or something like that. Those can also be restricted by the license you have. So for example, you might be licensed to have 4 simultaneous render events going on at the same time. That's why some of those are also limited. The only really hard and fast rule here is if you're using a distributed install, you want to make sure that this controller capacity for the application server is at least as large as the capacity for any other eTwist, render, etc. you may have in your cluster, just so you can manage all that incoming work and disperse it out. But basically, yeah, here you just have a whole list of everything here. If I want to see what's going through on a server, I can click here and to see, for example, here's everything that's at a digital delivery step on this particular server right now. I can look and see, maybe I don't think I have anything at preview generation right now. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a few things here that are queued at preview generation, for example, and you have some of the same controls where you can see you can hold that, you can abort that queue entry if something's not going through after 5-6 hours. So yeah, that's the basic gist of how this is set up. The one other thing that's worth noting in here, this is a good troubleshooting area for when you install the ES application, if you're using a distributed system and you have maybe an eTwist server, that will tend to wind up getting all those devices installed on it. So you'll have an eTwist server that might have the digital or the preview generation plug in it just by default, but it's not licensed for that. One of the tricks you can run into is if those devices are set so that you have for preview generation instances that can run on that server, but you're not licensed for it, it won't warn you until the file goes through. You might see an error in a preview generation step. This is one good thing you can check and see if in the queue anything's running through for that specific instance on one of the servers that's not licensed for it. ES doesn't check until that actually runs, so you'd find out in here and you can say, okay, that shouldn't be running. I can change that capacity to 0 for that particular server. If I want to see everything running through the server, I can hit the check here just to see all of that as well. So that's about the gist of how that's set up. Now, if you want to deal with, this is good for both this and the system activity areas are good for if you're dealing with work that's all that's active on the system currently. But a lot of times you have something, maybe you had a file that went through earlier in the day or 2 days ago that you need to find out what happened there. A good source of information for that sort of thing is the event logs. ES keeps track of just key logs for all those queue events for, I want to say, I think it's about 90 days. That can be tweaked under the hood, but it keeps historical data on all those. So if I look in here, actually, I think I might have to refresh this. Yeah, I have that a little too filtered here, but basically you can filter on a day. So if I wanted to see everything in here that's run through my system within the last day, let me get rid of those and hit apply. It'll show me all the stuff that's gone through my system. I can filter, I can see, okay, I had stuff go through approval Wiffle. You can see some logs if they're available. Usually it'll show you the JDF information for that specific task. But if I wanted to see, for example, you can filter, maybe I want to see 2 days or 3. The one thing I would watch out for in this window is sometimes if you try and make the filter basically, if you're doing a filter from maybe the beginning of July to the beginning of August, sometimes if you pick too large of a range, it won't show anything, or you'll see truncated results. So I tend to, you can filter on specific date ranges, but it's a good idea in practice to keep that shorter so you know you're getting everything that's really going on in the system. But this is still a lot of information, so if you need to filter that into something more manageable, you do have the ability to sort by project, by user, category, or status. So for example, maybe if I want to see just the files that have any processes that have aborted, I can click here and see everything. If I want to get more nitty-gritty, I can say I want to see everything with a certain project template, or maybe I only want to see from my customer, only things that have aborted from my customer with the project bogus transmit. So So now I see everything that's failed, logs I have for everything that's failed in that project, and I can get some of the error messages for what went wrong there. What this is also really useful for is you can actually see, for example, let's say you have an email notification set up to be a little too gung-ho, and maybe someone's getting more emails, notification emails than they want, like they're getting an email every 2 or 3 minutes and they want it really once an hour. You can filter by event type in here, so I can filter and say I want to see mail events. And you can filter even more specifically. If I wanted to see stuff that was sent to an email address like arogala@blandsys.com, I can type that in there and filter and see exactly the emails that user got. And in fact, even click on them and see the contents of that email. So if they're saying I'm getting spammed, you can log in here. You can see exactly what sort of messages they're getting without needing to rely on them to forward all of those to you. So really useful here. Those logs can even be exported. So for example, if you needed to do some kind of an audit on users that were logged into the system, there's a user event in here. I can say I want to see everyone who's logged into the main organization within the last day. I can get a list of that and I can export that as a CSV for whatever reporting or just audit purposes I might have within my organization. So that's about the gist of how that works. The next real step to look at too would be registered files. Maybe if you're dealing with if you have very specific rule sets. I know this is one thing that can be confusing, is if you have very specific rule sets where maybe files need to match a very distinct naming convention, or you're pulling things in from a hot folder and you're trying to figure out what went on. You can use registered files to find out a little more information about what happened during that file input. And here, if I set this to all, it'll show me everything that's come into the system. I can see information on what rules it matched. If I want to see specifically why one or two things failed, I can filter and say not assigned. If I click on any of these, it'll show me a log for that particular event. So I can see here this was set to a rule set named demo restrictive. It didn't have NS in the file name, so it didn't go any further. The real benefit of a screen like this is, one thing I don't think a lot of customers have utilized is maybe you're in a pinch, you're in a situation where there's something in your rule set, a file name doesn't quite match, but you don't have the time to change it, or you don't want to make drastic changes to a rule set just before a magazine closes, for example. You also have the ability in here where you can do direct assignment. So I can say I want to push a file into a certain customer. So maybe I want to filter this into my customer bogus transmit. I can go in here and do a direct assignment and place that page so that I don't have to toggle that rule set when I'm in the middle of a crunch time. So now, the one thing in here that's worth noting is for hot folder uploads, if you have a hot folder upload that doesn't match regular expression or doesn't match a rule set, it will display in here. I know the one thing that can be a little confusing is, let me pull up, I think I have my VM up here somewhere. I'll hop onto ES. Helps if you type the right password. So I'm going to rename one of these. I think I dumped a few of these in already. So if I dump it, actually I can probably dump it in as it is. So the rule set I have on here is really restrictive. Nothing will get picked up unless it matches NS within the file name. So these aren't going to get picked up. But what does tend to happen for things like this is there's a hidden folder under any hot folder you make called .moved. You typically can't see that unless you have your view configured a certain way. That moved folder is, if ES doesn't know where to place the file, it doesn't pull it into a project. It pulls it into that hidden .moved folder. So you can see I have some past tests in here that never made it in. They wind up in the moved folder, and these two are actually going to pop in there pretty soon too. But yeah, you can see actually one of them just jumped in there right now. So they actually get named if they're duplicates. They should get named, I think, with an underscore and then the number of the duplicate at the end. Yep, so you can see we have a 43 SB1115 PDF underscore 2. So it doesn't overwrite those. But yeah, if you've ever seen a case where you push something in a hot folder, you don't see it in the project you're expecting it in, you can always check here to make sure that ES at least picked it up, and then get a little more information from this screen here, which will tell you maybe why that didn't get placed. You can use that direct assignment to assign it to a project if you need to, or you can modify the rule set there. So you've got some tools at your disposal. Those folders can take up a lot of space if you never clear out those old files. The one setting that's really great for those is under System Configuration. There is a clean unassigned files after amount of days. So you can set that up so that if nothing's been picked up, if these haven't been picked up after 3 days from this moved folder through a direct assignment or whatever, just get rid of them. So that way you don't have those winding up existing on a share, taking up a lot of space, especially if you're dealing with like raw files or anything of that nature that's very space demanding. So for a lot of what we dealt with there, that's more all this stuff with registered files, system activity, event logs, and the devices. A lot of that's more based off of the ESQ. That's more just app server related. When you delve into workflows, that's where you're dealing with a lot more of the JDF messages specifically, which can be a little harder to interpret initially. So what we'll do here is I'm going to pop into, I have a project here that's set up with a workflow that is configured to automatically fail every time. So play window Tetris here real quick. I have a folder here. So any file I upload into this project, I think I'll pick this one. Anything I upload into here is going to fail. So you'll see this immediately failed because I have this configured to write to a folder that ES doesn't have permissions to. So the way this works is if I want to troubleshoot an issue like this and see what happened in a workflow, I can go into Document Workflow, Show Workflow. You can also hit the W key, which is a little quicker. This will bring up a little facsimile of my ES workflow. I can see what's going on here. I can see it passed input files at this time, preview generation at this time, and it aborted in digital delivery. If you're coming from more of a twist context, you'd probably go to the workflow log, but this doesn't really tell you too much information about what failed. Where the real meat of the error message is in the, there are these JDF and JDF out areas up here. And what those do is those show you the actual messages that the application server is communicating to that device via web services, and the information that that device is returning back to web services. So for example, here for preview generation, if I go to JVF Output, you can see some information in here. There's a lot of stuff buried in here, but you can see, you can basically grok that here, for example, I'm pulling saying take this file and make a preview in this folder with this name. So you have a little information about what it's doing. I don't see anything too crazy in here. This is mostly just messages for ES. It's a little more distinctive if you have an issue like with this digital delivery. If I go to JDF Output for this, you have a lot of the normal stuff you have. Take this file from this folder, make a copy in this folder, and this path does not exist. And you'll see this huge kind of wall of text down here under this error tag here. What this really does is this signifies there was an error in this specific event. And that error, it's a Java error. So what it says is here you have, it defines what the error is. It's a java.io exception. Anytime you see that java.something.exception, that usually tells you that there's been an error on that tool. Those codes aren't usually DALiM specific. They're, for example, if you Google that, you can find out information what IO exception means. The next little bit of information here tells you what actually happened. Permission denied at java.io.unix file system. That gives you a little more information about what went wrong. So it permission denied, it couldn't make a folder there at that path because it didn't have permissions. And then all this other information here is just, it just tells the developer where that failed in that specific application of ES. So that's more information for the developer. But if you see anything formatted like this, it's a signifier that there was a specific type of error on the system. So you can then use that and take steps to remedy that. One of the more useful features I've found for dealing with this sort of thing is if you're in a situation where you need to fix it for one file, you can actually go up when you're viewing the workflow for a specific file. You can click the pen icon up here to go into editing mode. So for example, for this file, I can just get rid of that step, or I could change that to a digital delivery step, which was configured correctly. And I can edit that and save it. So now if I rerun this, and click Restart Step, then this workflow is going to continue perfectly. The nice thing about that is it changed the workflow for only this specific file. So everything else, that actual workflow, if I actually went into administration, is still the same as it was with that bad digital delivery. What this is really useful for is if you're in a situation, it's something Twist didn't have, is that you're in a situation where you're on the fly, you need to fix something from just one file to get it through. You can tweak that very easily in here. It's also great for if you're developing a new workflow. You don't necessarily have to go back to the main workflow and edit that every time. Go to the administration edit, upload a file, go back to administration edit. You can do it all in one place, and you don't have to worry about making a change that's going to break the workflow that you're developing. So very useful container there. The other thing that's great in here is actually the one thing to watch out for is smart quotes. If you're dealing with, sometimes if we send out a response and a help desk ticket, or maybe someone else in your organization emails you a piece of code for an ES link or sends you one over an IM, sometimes a lot of those applications like Outlook are notorious for converting the quotes in that text to what are called smart quotes. So you'll see that here. I'm actually going to take from copy from another window on my screen. So you might wind up, maybe you want to have something here. I have to refresh this real quick, actually. Here we go. So if I paste in code like this, you'll actually see that these are curved. These quotes are kind of curved on this. They're smart quotes. And so one of the issues there is ES doesn't interpret those correctly like it would normal quotes. So for example, here, if I go and I'll save that and reprocess, this should wind up aborting there. So if you want to see what's going wrong in a program link like this, where you have to go to see that, is it'll show it as always having failed in the step before it actually, the step immediately preceding the link that it failed in. So if I go up to Wiffle Log, Workflow Log, and I click on, I think preview generation should be somewhere here, you can see the error message. That's the same thing of an error storage exception, error parsing the quote token at this line. So that tells you a little more of, okay, this is the sort of error I have at this link. And so that signifies there was a error in my program link there. Now, if I go back in here and actually got to click this guy, and I think I got one more that's snuck up here too. And I change these to non-smart quotes. One on the end looks fine, but if I hit save and reprocess this should run through this time. Yep, so that went through fine. So the other things you can do in a situation like this where you're dealing with potential for error, maybe you have a step where you're particularly prone to error. You can put in, for example, there are, if you edit one of these links by double clicking, you can configure other on error. So you can have a link, so if preview generation fails, there's one error link down to maybe like a digital delivery here to send a mail to alert someone. So you can use those to give the workflow a little smoother of a landing. The one other one I've been playing with recently that I've really come to like is if you go under workflow setup, find it here real quick. I have a Wiffle Catch error. And this is a simple workflow. It just takes a file and it generates a preview and sends a digital delivery. This digital delivery is configured to send an email. I think I have it up here. And what this does is this $ creator up here, what this does is that's configured for whoever is assigned the creator user role in a project will get an email saying this file failed in this customer in this project. You can make these a little more nitty gritty. You could even actually put text in there. You could put Java links in the beginning of a workflow to save into metadata what workflow it was supposed to run through so that you can use that in this email too. Where the power with this comes is if I have my bogus workflow here, when you're defining a workflow, there's a workflow and error option up here. So I have a Wiffle Catch error here. So it says if this workflow fails, then go to this catch error workflow. So if I actually pop over to this bogus transmit and I look at one of these files, you'll see that there is a digital delivery step there that gives me a little information about what happened in this step. And if I actually go over to my, let me see where I have too many windows open here. So you can see for one of the files we just uploaded, that 5NS, you can see in here it's that file failed in this workflow and in this customer in this project. And the really nice thing about using one of those Wiffle on error steps is you don't have to code that into every workflow. You don't have to put links for every single place where it can fail. You can have one thing that gives you a smooth landing and gives you a notification or takes on some other process. Maybe you have a situation where you have a workflow. If a file fails some kind of complicated normalization workflow, it goes through a more basic workflow to at least generate a preview. So you can use that so it fails a little more gently. And here with that email, the nice thing about that is that code reuse, because you don't have to build that for every single workflow. You set it once, any workflow that needs that configured can use it, and then really whoever gets this creator role down here gets an email when something blows up. So really useful there, and you could even have a role like it's maybe like admins, and so that's set on the fly for that project. Whoever's set in there gets an email. You don't have to have separate output channels for all the different people that need emails for different customers, workflows, failures. So the one other thing you can do with Java links to make things a little easier, let me pull up, I think I have a workflow here that'll be a good example. So I have a workflow here, image resize, and this workflow is set so they can be run on any file. So for example, here if I want to start workflow, I can start this resize image workflow. Maybe it's you want to smash a PDF into a JPEG and then resize it to a certain dimension for a thumbnail. I have some little basic things set up in here. You can enter a width, you can enter a height, you can enter whether it's inches or millimeters. So you can use different dimensions. Now what this workflow is going to do under the hood is, I don't actually have any image resizing logic in here, but there's a link in here. Maybe you'd have an eTwist step in here, but I have a link in here that handles that difference in units. So basically what it's doing is first it's parsing it's trying to parse a double is basically a floating point number, anything with a decimal. So it's trying to parse from that metadata a double and say I want to grab a double at this step if I can from this variable. Normally if that fails, if maybe someone put in some character that wasn't acceptable, this would just error out in this link. The one thing I did here to prevent that is I put in what's called a try-catch statement. And the try-catch statement is you have the try, you have a bracket, the command you want to run, and then you have a catch afterwards. So I have catch exception E, catch if anything errors in here, then take this other action. So here it tries to parse any floating point number out of this variable that's in my metadata from that job ticket. If it fails, it sets a variable called debug invalid width to true. Down here I have another one for my height, same thing, tries to parse the height. If it can't, sets a debug invalid height true. There's also some information here I logged because I'm doing a conversion from inches to millimeters in certain cases. So I log the width and height before the conversion. I log if it reaches this if statement for the conversion, and then I log the values after that. This context.set variable is a little different than context.set metadata. This isn't exactly associated with a page order like context.set metadata. This is more associated with the workflow running through a specific instance of that workflow with a file. So you can set little basic flags like you might in Twist without necessarily having to write all those into metadata. They're less flexible, but they're also less accessible to the customer and a little easier for just kind of one-off storage during the course of a simple workflow. So what we'll actually see as we go back here, the file that I started that workflow on. If I go in here, I'll pull down, I should have a resized image in here. And if I look at the Wiffle Log show context here, it's going to show me under workflow, you'll see I have all my variables in here. So I have my debug, my height was originally 4 inches width was 3 inches, I can see that it reached that if statement that did the conversion, and then I can also see the output of that conversion. These are really nice. These are lightweight. You can leave some of these in a workflow. Maybe if you're doing some complex math, or there's some more complex switches. If you have a case where something doesn't go the way you expected it to in that program link, this is useful for just figuring out what happened after the fact. You can leave these little debug statements in there to show you really what's going on as it runs. So that way, if you change something and suddenly it's not hitting that loop where it converts from inches to millimeters, you're aware of that. So really useful there. The one other trick too, because I know one of the things that can get tricky with these is if you're trying to figure out how to reference these in a link. Maybe I want to grab the creation tool of the PDF and use that in a program link somewhere. It can be tricky to go through to the context.get metadata and figure out what the right parameters are. I know that can be a source of frustration. So the one utility you have to make that a little easier is if you select anything in this show context window and hit the I up here, it'll give you the Java, the JavaScript, and the tickle code to get that metadata. So you can see here this var mdt equals context.get metadata. I can paste this into a Java link, and then that variable MDT will immediately have this information. I didn't have to kind of brute force or think my way through what arguments I needed there. In the same way, one of these, if I wanted to see what if my loop was reached, or maybe to throw an error, actually that one's not going to show me that, but that's simple enough to get. But even stuff in here, like if I want to see a customer name, you can get the information for how I would reference that. So really useful utility if you need to get the correct syntax to access the variable on the quick. So now the next step is if you're dealing with a lot of this has been file processing or load. Sometimes you're dealing with a situation where maybe you have an issue with the interface or something on the back end and you want to dig a little deeper into the logs. There's a few different ways you can find out some of that information. The first is by using the Catalina log. I have a SSH connection to my ES server over here. So the way this works is this log lives at a certain path, symlinks, common, Tomcat 7.0, logs, Catalina.out. And basically this is more a just larger scale under the hood log that shows you a lot of what's going on in the back end of ES. The tail command here basically just says, watch that file. This is just a normal text file in the file system at this path. Tail -f would basically follow that file and show me any new changes that occur in that file while I'm watching it. You can also put in, if you wanted to see the last 300 lines, for example, tail -300 would just show you the last 300 lines. These files are very large to sift through by hand, but a lot of good information here. So here I hit enter a few times just to make a space. So if I run into a situation where, for example, this file, we know this file is going to fail. If I hit reprocess, you'll see that digital delivery error we talked about showed up in this log. So that's the same one that was showing up in the JVF output, the permission denied. But this is a little more back end. If you're trying to see, you're not sure where an error is happening, you can look back here and see exactly what's happening in the system. I noticed there's that Java error there specifically. The one thing that's important to note with this is these logs are by design very verbose. They display a lot of things that are warnings that necessarily aren't cause for concern. I know, for example, with some customers who are using LDAP, LDAP tends to display a lot of warnings which aren't really anything significant or serious, but they'll keep showing up repeating in this log, and I know that's concerned some people. So this is a good resource. If you see anything that's consistently showing in here as like a minor error, but the system's operating fine, I wouldn't be too concerned about it. If you have a question, you can always send it to us in a ticket and we can tell you a little more info about that specific error. But this is another very useful resource for figuring out what's going on under the hood. The last one is for sometimes if you have an issue with the interface itself. Maybe it's something that's happening because there's a portion of the ES application that's running in your browser window. Maybe you're in a situation where something's messed up on the front end and there's nothing, everything on the back end's fine. I'm going to show you one example. This is, I'm running an older build here with a specific bug. This is fixed in current builds. A customer found to be reported to DALiM and they got it fixed in pretty quick order. But if I go down to customization, metadata sets, in the build I'm running here, if I make I actually don't want to make a new metadata set. I'm going to go to job ticket layout. So if I go in here, and in this build, there was a bug where if you put an exclamation point in the name of a job ticket layout, it would freeze certain parts of the interface. So I have a job ticket layout here. I'm going to attach this globally to all projects in my system. So what happens here is if I go to a project and I try and view that project, I got a problem. I can't click on anything in here. Nothing's loading. And if I tell the Catalina log here, that's not going to show me anything. Like if I go back, actually, I'll refresh this. So I re-trigger that. You'll see nothing showing up in here. This doesn't see anything wrong on the back end because this is purely in the interface. The one utility you have to deal with situations like this is most modern web browsers have some kind of developer tools. They're pretty much standard across the gamut of browsers. Firefox has them, Chrome has them, Safari has them. They tend to live in a little different places depending on the browser you're using. In my browser here, I'm just going to go up to Tools and Developer Tools, and it's going to bring up a new window. In that window, I'm going to go to a console area on here. And if I actually reload this page so we re-trigger that error, you'll see in here my page isn't loading, but I got an error in this web console. You'll see in here uncaught syntax error, unexpected token, exclamation point. I know that that's, hey, I put an exclamation point in that job ticket I added today, so that might be the cause of that. And it gives it a little more information for the developers on where that's occurring. So that's another way, if you're not sure why something's happening, that can give you a little more information, at least to confirm or deny that there is an issue there. So I'm going to get rid of that job ticket before that causes any more issues. Again, that is fixed in current builds, so that's not going to be an issue for you guys. So that's really the gist of how a lot of that works. A few more specific error messages that are worth noting. One is, for example, maybe you have a machine where you lose your internet connection. I actually should have a VM here I can test this with. But if you lose your internet connection, or you lose connection to the ES server, one of the more cryptic errors ES tends to display is you'll see a message that says bad server response. So if you're in a situation where actually, I don't know if I have a machine I can test on. Let me see here real quick. That VM might work nicely. I'm starting that up 1 second. So for your example, I'll go to Firefox and load up my ES installation. And I know we're running tight on time, so I'll try and wrap this up pretty quickly. So for example, if I'm in my ES system and I disconnect the network here, you'll see I'll get a bad server response here in a minute. So that's typically what that error means, is either there was a network connectivity issue or you physically got disconnected from the system. That's where that tends to show up. Not going to behave for that specific instance. As far as other error messages worth noting, I think I have, so let's say I install an old license. I have a license that expires. Another message you'll wind up seeing is, yeah, here's one that expired last year. So if I put this license in place, you'll see another. These messages are cryptic by design, so they don't let a customer know that your license is out of date. So if I go to, once Tomcat restarts for me, yeah, it looks like that's going to take a few minutes to come back up. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, if I go in here, I got an error. Sometimes you'll see a screen that says system unavailable, contact your administrator. That's typically the one you'll see in most cases. But yeah, if you see something like this, or system unavailable, contact your administrator, it tends to mean that you have an issue where either the database is not hooked up properly, or you have an issue where your license is out of date. So that's about the basic gist of ES troubleshooting. Is there any questions from anyone? Mike, do you see any questions over there?
Well, I'm logged in as a question-free user, so if there's questions, I don't see them here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any either, so I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you for attending. And be sure to check out, again, blanchardsystems.com/events to see a list of upcoming events. Thank you for attending and have a great day.